Bruno Ludke was born in 1908 in the small town of Reichenbrand, near Chemnitz, in the Saxony region of Germany. From the very beginning, his life was marked by challenges that would follow him throughout his short and troubled existence. Bruno was the youngest of several children in a modest, working-class family. His father worked as a laborer, often taking long hours at factories and construction sites, while his mother tended to the household. The family struggled to make ends meet, and young Bruno grew up in an environment where economic hardship was a constant presence. From an early age, it became clear that Bruno faced difficulties that set him apart from other children. Those who observed him during his formative years described him as having limited intellectual capacity, struggling with basic tasks that his peers mastered with ease. Reports from local schools suggest that Bruno had a delayed development in speech and learning, making it difficult for him to fit into traditional educational settings. Teachers often described him as slow, quiet, and socially withdrawn, a boy who seemed more comfortable in isolation than in the company of others. Despite these challenges, Bruno displayed a fascination with death and illness that was both disturbing and difficult for adults to understand. He was known to spend long hours wandering through fields, observing insects and animals, and showing an unusual curiosity about injured or dying creatures. While some considered this mere childhood curiosity, others later speculated that these early behaviors foreshadowed the macabre interests that would define his later life. Bruno's home life added another layer of difficulty to his early development. His family was not particularly nurturing, and accounts suggest that he received little emotional support. Siblings, focused on their own survival and social integration, often ignored or ridiculed him. In a time when mental health was poorly understood, and children with developmental delays were often marginalized, Bruno lacked the guidance and care that might have helped him navigate his formative years more safely. By the time he reached adolescence, Bruno's behavior had already begun to attract attention outside the home. Neighbors reported incidents that, while minor, were alarming in retrospect. He had a tendency to wander into nearby farms and homes, sometimes taking small items without permission. More troubling, however, were stories of him harming small animals, an early indicator that would later be cited in discussions of his violent tendencies. Despite these warning signs, there was no official intervention. In a rural Germany still recovering from the aftermath of World War I, social services were limited, and cases like Bruno's often went unnoticed or were dismissed as eccentricities. Bruno's adolescence was further complicated by the societal upheaval of post-World War I Germany. The country was facing severe economic instability, political unrest, and a social environment that was harsh and unforgiving. For a young man like Bruno, who struggled to communicate and understand social norms, navigating this world was a challenge. He left school early, as many children of his social standing were forced to do, and began working odd jobs that required minimal skill. It was during this period that his social isolation deepened, and his behavior became more erratic. Mental health professionals today would likely describe Bruno as having a significant intellectual disability combined with behavioral issues that placed him at risk for antisocial tendencies. At the time, however, such conditions were not well understood. People in his community viewed him as odd, sometimes labeling him as slow or strange. There were no formal diagnoses, no therapeutic interventions, and certainly no safety nets to prevent the trajectory that his life would eventually take. Despite these early challenges, Bruno Ludke grew into a man who appeared at least superficially, unremarkable to the casual observer. He was described as physically unimposing, a man of average build, quiet demeanor, and unassuming presence. This outward normalcy, however, masked the inner struggles and dark tendencies that would later define his life in ways both tragic and horrifying. His early exposure to death, combined with social isolation and cognitive limitations, created a perfect storm of vulnerability and danger. It is also important to understand the historical context in which Bruno grew up. Germany during the 1910s and 1920s was a nation in turmoil. The aftermath of World War I left communities devastated, with widespread poverty, malnutrition, and instability. Medical and psychological understanding was limited, and those who deviated from social norms were often marginalized. For a young man like Bruno Ludke, this environment provided little opportunity for support or intervention. His mental impairments and antisocial tendencies went largely unnoticed or misunderstood, setting the stage for the tragic and controversial events that would later unfold. As Bruno approached adulthood, he was already marked by the combination of social isolation, cognitive challenges, and a fascination with death and suffering. These early years, though seemingly unremarkable in isolation, were critical in shaping the trajectory of his life. The patterns of behavior established during childhood would echo throughout his adult life, informing both the alleged criminal acts for which he would later be accused and the broader questions about culpability and mental fitness. By the end of the 1920s, Bruno Ludke had emerged from childhood as a man struggling to navigate a complex world. While outwardly quiet and compliant, he carried within him impulses and tendencies that, when coupled with the societal chaos of Nazi-era Germany, would eventually thrust him into historical notoriety. His early life provides essential context for understanding not just the man himself, but also the environment that allowed his alleged crimes to go unnoticed for so long, and the tragic circumstances surrounding his death in Nazi custody years later. As Bruno Ludke transitioned from adolescence into adulthood in the late 1920s, his life remained characterized by isolation, poverty, and limited opportunities. The social and economic conditions of Germany at this time were harsh, and for a young man with intellectual and developmental challenges, the difficulties were compounded. Ludke had left school early, unable to cope with the demands of formal education, and found work wherever he could. He took on odd jobs, often physically demanding and poorly paid, ranging from farm labor to factory work, tasks that required little literacy or social skill. Despite his outwardly unremarkable appearance, Bruno began to exhibit behaviors that were increasingly troubling. His fascination with death and injury persisted, manifesting in ways that alarmed neighbors and those who interacted with him. He was reportedly drawn to scenes of accidents and sickness, observing wounded animals and humans alike. Some accounts suggest he would attempt to assist, though his understanding of appropriate care was limited and often misguided. Others, however, recalled instances of cruelty, such as harming small animals or engaging in acts that caused unnecessary suffering. These early signs of deviant behavior foreshadowed the patterns that would later define the criminal accusations against him. Ludke's social interactions during this period were minimal. He remained on the periphery of his community, often misunderstood and ridiculed by those around him. His coworkers tolerated his presence, but rarely considered him a peer. His family, though still present, was largely preoccupied with survival and offered little in the way of emotional support or guidance. This combination of social isolation, lack of supervision, and innate cognitive challenges created an environment in which Ludke's impulses could develop unchecked. During these years, there were reports of minor criminal activity associated with Luck. While historical records are often fragmented and inconsistent, some sources indicate that he was occasionally involved in petty theft and trespassing. These acts were not violent in nature and were generally seen as the misbehavior of a man struggling to navigate social norms. At the time, authorities did not recognize him as a serious threat, and no formal criminal record was established. However, these incidents provided early warnings of a tendency toward boundary crossing behavior, an inclination that would later be scrutinized in the context of far more serious allegations. The late 1920s and early 1930s were also a period of personal development for Luck in terms of daily habits and routines. He lived a largely solitary existence, wandering through villages, fields, and small towns. This wandering behavior allowed him to observe the lives of others from a distance, an activity that some historians suggest may have influenced his later selection of alleged victims. While there is no definitive evidence that he committed violent acts during this period, his proximity to human suffering, combined with his mental and emotional immaturity, created conditions ripe for the development of dangerous impulses. It was during this period that Bruno began to be associated with the earliest suspicions of violent crime, though much of the historical evidence is disputed. According to some contemporary accounts, local authorities noted his presence near unexplained deaths or injuries, particularly among the elderly and infirm. Lucky's limited intelligence and inability to articulate himself effectively made him a convenient scapegoat for unexplained incidents. In the absence of concrete evidence, these suspicions remained largely speculative. But they laid the groundwork for the later accusations that would engulf him during the Nazi era. One of the more troubling aspects of Luck's young adulthood was the lack of any formal assessment of his mental state. Today, psychologists might recognize signs of intellectual disability, impaired judgment, and potential psychopathy. In 1920s Germany, however, such conditions were poorly understood, and individuals like Luck were often dismissed as merely slow or odd. This lack of professional evaluation meant that interventions which could have altered his trajectory, structured support, vocational guidance, or psychological therapy, were never provided. The absence of such intervention left Luck vulnerable both to societal pressures and to the darker aspects of his own impulses. By the mid-1930s, Luck had entered full adulthood, a man still physically unimposing, socially awkward, and intellectually limited, yet marked by an unusual fascination with death and illness. Historians note that he often sought employment in environments where he could observe vulnerability. Hospitals, nursing homes, and care facilities, though again, there is no conclusive evidence of wrongdoing during this period. What is clear is that these placements, combined with his cognitive limitations, placed him in close proximity to individuals who were unable to defend themselves, heightening suspicions later in his life. It is also during this period that Luck's life intersected with broader societal changes. The Nazi Party was rising to power, emphasizing ideologies of racial purity, social control, and surveillance. The state's approach to crime and deviance was increasingly authoritarian, relying on both formal policing and social informants. In such an environment, someone like Bruno Luck, already marginalized by his cognitive impairments, became an easy target for scrutiny. Local authorities began to keep records of his movements and behaviors, though these reports were often contradictory and lacking in concrete evidence. While concrete details of Luck's alleged crimes during his young adulthood remain elusive, Historians agree that this period is critical in understanding the trajectory of his life. The combination of intellectual disability, social isolation, fascination with death, minor criminal activity, and proximity to vulnerable populations created a profile that, when later combined with Nazi-era surveillance and suspicion, made him a candidate for accusation. His story serves as a chilling example of how societal misunderstanding, combined with historical context, can lead to the construction of a criminal narrative that may or may not reflect reality. By the end of the 1930s, Bruno Ludke had established a pattern of behavior and circumstances that would make him both vulnerable and infamous. He was a man who, despite a quiet and unassuming outward appearance, carried within him tendencies and vulnerabilities that, under the right historical and social conditions, would intersect tragically with the mechanisms of power and suspicion in Nazi Germany. The next chapter will examine the period in which Ludke is alleged to have committed his first murders, exploring the historical records, police suspicions, and the broader context of crime and punishment during this turbulent era. As Bruno Ludke moved deeper into adulthood during the 1930s, his life, while outwardly quiet and routine, became increasingly intertwined with a dark and disturbing series of events. This period is marked by the first suspicions of violent acts, particularly against vulnerable individuals in the community, though the historical record is both fragmented and contested. Historians note that the lack of formal investigative procedures and the chaotic social environment of Nazi-era Germany contributed to uncertainty about the full extent of Ludke's alleged actions. Nevertheless, this is the period when his name first appears in connection with unexplained deaths, setting the stage for later accusations that would define his historical notoriety. The first alleged murders attributed to Ludke reportedly involved elderly or infirm individuals in his local area. Many of these victims were described as fragile, socially isolated, or otherwise unable to defend themselves, which some researchers argue may have aligned with Ludke's cognitive profile and behavioral tendencies. Accounts from neighbors and caretakers suggest that Ludke had a habit of frequenting hospitals, sanatoriums, and private homes where he could observe patients or residents. While some interpreted his presence as benign curiosity or even helpfulness, others later argued that these interactions gave him opportunities to commit acts of violence, though definitive evidence is largely absent. Police records from the era are limited and often inconsistent, reflecting both the administrative chaos of pre-war Germany and the selective preservation of files under the Nazi regime. Contemporary investigators allege that Ludke was present at numerous unexplained deaths, leading to suspicions of serial killings. Reports suggest a pattern. The victims were often elderly women, alone in their homes or in care facilities, and died under circumstances that local authorities could not immediately explain. Some historians question whether these deaths were naturally occurring or the result of foul play, noting that the evidence connecting Ludke to these incidents was primarily circumstantial. Eyewitness accounts, when available, painted a troubling picture. Some neighbors recalled seeing Ludke near the homes of deceased individuals shortly before their deaths. Others reported that he displayed an unusual interest in the conditions of the victims, observing their movements or offering unsolicited assistance. These behaviors, though not necessarily criminal in themselves, contributed to a growing suspicion among local authorities that Ludke may have been involved in something far more sinister than petty theft or minor mischief. One of the most controversial aspects of Ludke's suspected crimes was the method of alleged killing. According to some sources, He may have used poison or other subtle means to bring about death, targeting individuals who were already frail or ill. This suggested a predatory approach, allowing him to exploit the vulnerabilities of his victims without drawing immediate attention. However, it is important to note that concrete forensic evidence linking Luck to these deaths is almost entirely absent. The nature of medical record keeping at the time, combined with the social stigma attached to both mental disability and elder care, made it extremely difficult to establish direct proof of wrongdoing. The political climate of Nazi Germany further complicated matters. By the mid-1930s, the Nazi regime was consolidating power, emphasizing strict social control and surveillance. The state promoted narratives of criminality and deviance, sometimes exaggerating or fabricating threats to justify authoritarian policies. Within this environment, Luck's intellectual disability and social awkwardness made him a convenient target for suspicion. Authorities may have amplified their concerns, portraying him as a serial killer based on incomplete or circumstantial evidence. Some historians argue that his case was exploited to reinforce state narratives about criminality and societal purification, though others maintain that Luck may have committed acts of violence independently of political pressures. It was during this time that Luck's behavior reportedly escalated from observation and minor offenses to actions that raised serious questions. Accounts suggest that he was seen handling personal belongings of deceased individuals and lingering at death scenes for reasons he could not clearly explain. While these behaviors could be interpreted as morbid curiosity, they were also consistent with behaviors later associated with serial offenders, such as revisiting crime scenes and collecting trophies. The ambiguity of these actions, combined with Luck's inability to articulate motives, made it difficult for investigators and historians alike to separate fact from speculation. Despite the growing suspicion, Luck was not immediately apprehended. Local authorities lacked sufficient evidence to pursue formal charges, and the fragmented nature of record keeping allowed him to continue his life largely unchecked. He continued to move between jobs, hospitals, and care facilities, maintaining the appearance of an ordinary, if somewhat awkward, member of society. This period of apparent normalcy, however, was punctuated by ongoing questions about his presence near unexplained deaths, fueling the rumors and narratives that would later define his infamous reputation. Some researchers argue that Luck's alleged first murders reflect a combination of opportunity and personal impulse rather than a carefully planned pattern of serial killing. His intellectual limitations may have prevented him from fully understanding the consequences of his actions, while his fascination with death and human vulnerability could have driven him to acts that others perceived as criminally intentional. The intersection of these personal tendencies with the chaotic social environment of Nazi Germany created a situation in which suspicion could easily escalate into accusation. By the end of the 1930s, Bruno Ludke had become a figure of local concern, while definitive proof of murder was lacking. His presence at multiple unexplained deaths, combined with his social isolation and intellectual challenges, created a profile that authorities could not ignore. The alleged first murders of this period set the foundation for the extensive investigation and eventual accusations that would consume him in the early 1940s. They also raised enduring questions about the nature of culpability, the reliability of historical records, and the extent to which societal prejudice and misunderstanding may have shaped his legacy. This chapter demonstrates the complex interplay between individual behavior, social vulnerability, and historical context. Lucke's alleged first murders remain shrouded in uncertainty, yet they provide critical insight into the conditions that allowed him to be suspected of crimes on a scale that may have been exaggerated or misunderstood. Understanding this period is essential for evaluating both the man and the historical circumstances that contributed to his notoriety, and it lays the groundwork for examining the broader Nazi-era context in which his life and alleged crimes unfolded. To fully understand the life and alleged crimes of Bruno Ludke, it is essential to examine the broader social and political context of Nazi-era Germany, particularly between 1933 and 1939. This period saw the rise of Adolf Hitler and the National Socialist German Workers' Party, whose ideology and policies transformed virtually every aspect of German life. For someone like Ludke, a mentally impaired, socially isolated man, these changes created conditions that would directly influence his life, the perception of his actions, and the historical narrative constructed around him. When the Nazis came to power in 1933, they implemented a regime built on strict control, racial ideology, and an obsession with social order. The government closely monitored the population, particularly those considered undesirable or deviant, which included criminals, mentally ill individuals, and the intellectually disabled. People like Ludke, who already lived on the margins of society due to cognitive impairments, became particularly vulnerable to scrutiny and surveillance. The state emphasized conformity, punishing those who deviated from accepted norms and often exaggerating or misrepresenting behavior to fit ideological narratives. During this period, the Nazi regime also implemented policies that blurred the lines between crime, disease, and moral failing. The concept of criminality was often intertwined with racial and mental evaluations. Those labeled as mentally impaired were not only marginalized, but sometimes viewed as morally or socially dangerous. The infamous Action T4 program, which would begin officially in 1939, exemplified this ideology, targeting the disabled and mentally ill for systematic euthanasia under the guise of public health. While Ludke's direct involvement in or targeting by such programs is debated, the social environment itself reinforced the perception that individuals like him were inherently suspicious or dangerous. The police and legal system were also undergoing dramatic transformation under Nazi rule. Law enforcement became highly centralized, with an emphasis on efficiency, order, and ideological loyalty rather than impartial justice. Criminal investigations often prioritized expedience over careful evidence gathering, and accusations could escalate quickly, especially when directed at marginalized individuals. In this environment, Bruno Ludke's intellectual disability, social awkwardness, and pattern of wandering into places where deaths occurred made him an easy subject for suspicion. Authorities may have connected him to unexplained deaths, not on the basis of clear evidence, but because his profile aligned with their perception of a potential criminal. Another critical element of this period was the broader societal fear of crime and deviance. Nazi propaganda regularly emphasized the dangers posed by degenerate individuals, from petty criminals to those deemed biologically or socially unfit. Newspapers, pamphlets, and state communications reinforced the notion that Germany faced internal threats that required vigilance and immediate action. Within such a climate, an individual like Ludke, already misunderstood by those around him, could easily be cast as a figure of fear, even without solid evidence of wrongdoing. Hospitals, sanatoriums, and nursing homes, where Ludke reportedly spent much of his time during the 1930s, were not immune to the influence of Nazi ideology. These institutions operated under increasing scrutiny, balancing medical care with political directives that prioritized the state's ideological goals. The treatment of patients was often shaped by bureaucratic efficiency and a chilling utilitarian logic, creating an environment in which unusual deaths could occur without rigorous investigation. Luck's presence in these facilities, whether as a worker, helper, or casual observer, placed him in proximity to vulnerable populations, feeding suspicions that would later be codified into criminal accusations. It is also important to recognize the social dynamics of small-town Germany during this era. Communities were tightly knit, yet gossip, rumor, and moral judgment played a significant role in shaping reputations. Bruno Ludke's intellectual limitations and peculiar behaviors made him stand out. Reports of him loitering near the homes of the elderly or wandering in hospitals were easily interpreted as sinister, particularly against the backdrop of a society that increasingly equated deviance with criminal intent. This combination of social misunderstanding, institutional inefficiency, and ideological fear amplified suspicions, creating a narrative that he may have committed acts far more heinous than any direct evidence could confirm. By the mid to late 1930s, Nazi Germany had created a society in which marginalized individuals like Ludke were inherently vulnerable to accusation. The overlap between real or perceived criminality and mental impairment, combined with ideological policing, meant that even minor or ambiguous behaviors could be interpreted as evidence of serious offenses. Ludke's pattern of wandering, his curiosity about death, and his presence near unexplained deaths fit the profile of a socially and ideologically constructed criminal figure, regardless of whether he actually committed the acts attributed to him. It is also worth noting that medical and forensic science in Germany during this period was primitive compared to modern standards. Autopsies, toxicology reports, and crime scene investigations were inconsistent, often influenced by local politics, resources, and ideological pressures. Many deaths that later were attributed to Ludke may have had natural causes or been the result of neglect, accidents, or illness. Nevertheless, the lack of precise scientific investigation allowed rumors and circumstantial evidence to dominate narratives, reinforcing suspicions and feeding the mythology of a serial killer in the making. For Bruno Ludke, the context of Nazi-era Germany created a perfect storm of vulnerability, suspicion, and potential danger. His intellectual disability and unusual behaviors made him stand out in a society obsessed with order and purity. His proximity to hospitals, care facilities, and isolated individuals provided the settings in which alleged crimes could be imagined, if not necessarily committed. And the political and social environment ensured that once suspicion arose, it could escalate rapidly, often without rigorous scrutiny. By the end of the 1930s, Ludke's life was intertwined with forces beyond his control. The combination of personal cognitive limitations, social isolation, and the authoritarian, ideologically charged environment of Nazi Germany set the stage for both the allegations of serial murder and his eventual tragic fate in custody. Understanding this context is essential not only for evaluating Ludke's life and actions, but also for interpreting the historical record and the ways in which societal, political, and institutional factors can shape the narrative of criminality. The next chapter will examine Bruno Ludke's investigation and eventual arrest, detailing the growing suspicion, police involvement, witness accounts, and the mechanisms of Nazi-era law enforcement that brought him under official scrutiny. By the late 1930s and early 1940s, Bruno Ludke had become a figure of growing suspicion within his local community, and eventually within the expanding Nazi law enforcement network. While much about Ludke's alleged activities remains shrouded in ambiguity, the historical record indicates that authorities began to focus on him due to a combination of circumstantial evidence, witness reports, and his consistent presence near unexplained deaths. This chapter explores the investigation process, his eventual arrest, and the complex circumstances that surrounded both events during a period of heightened state control and ideological policing. The investigation into Ludke's alleged crimes reportedly began with local authorities in Saxony noticing a pattern: unexplained deaths of elderly or infirm individuals in areas where Ludke was known to frequent. While many deaths at the time were assumed to be from natural causes, the clustering of incidents around Ludke's presence raised concerns among cautious officials. Some witnesses recalled seeing him in proximity to victims shortly before their deaths, and others noted his unusual interest in the conditions of the elderly and sick. These reports, though largely circumstantial, triggered initial inquiries into his activities. Investigators faced significant challenges. The forensic science of the era was rudimentary, and documentation of deaths was inconsistent, particularly in rural communities. Death certificates often lacked detailed explanations, and autopsies were rare except in cases of clear criminal suspicion. In this environment, authorities relied heavily on witness testimony and patterns of behavior to establish connections between individuals and crimes. Ludke's reputation as a socially awkward, mentally impaired man who wandered into hospitals and care facilities made him an easy target for suspicion, even in the absence of concrete evidence. As the investigation progressed, police reports describe attempts to track Ludke's movements and interview people who had seen him near victims. These inquiries included neighbors, hospital staff, and co-workers. Reports suggest that some witnesses interpreted his actions as strange or unsettling, while others viewed him with fear, associating his presence with the unexplained deaths in the community. However, the reliability of these testimonies is questionable. Ludke's cognitive limitations made it difficult for him to explain himself or provide coherent responses, leading authorities to interpret his silence or confusion as potential guilt. Ludke's arrest occurred within the broader context of Nazi Germany's highly centralized and authoritarian policing system. By 1939, the Gestapo and Kriminalpolizei, criminal police, had extended influence over regional investigations, emphasizing efficiency and ideological conformity over procedural justice. Once Ludke became a person of interest, the authorities acted decisively, seeking to contain what they believed could be a serial threat. Historical accounts indicate that he was detained quietly, without significant public attention, reflecting both the regime's control over information and the desire to investigate the matter internally. The exact circumstances of Ludke's arrest remain unclear, and much of what is known comes from second-hand reports and post-war documentation. It appears that Ludke was taken into custody in the early 1940s, possibly around 1943, after a series of deaths had drawn the attention of regional authorities. The decision to detain him may have been influenced as much by his mental disability and social marginalization as by any suspicion of criminal activity. Nazi officials often conflated intellectual impairment with moral deviance, and Ludke's cognitive challenges made him an easy target for accusation. Once in custody, Ludke was reportedly subjected to repeated interrogations. These sessions were characterized by the procedural and ideological constraints of Nazi-era law enforcement, prioritizing confession and expediency over objective evidence. Accounts suggest that Ludke, due to his limited cognitive abilities, struggled to comprehend the nature of the questioning and was easily influenced by leading questions or pressure from authorities. It is unclear whether he ever provided coherent admissions of guilt, but official reports later cited confessions, the accuracy of which remains widely disputed by historians. During this period, medical and psychological assessments were conducted in a manner consistent with the Nazi regime's priorities. Luck was diagnosed as mentally impaired, though the evaluation was superficial and off. For local communities, the narrative of his guilt, coupled with the dramatic circumstances of his detention and passing, created an enduring legend of a serial killer operating under the radar of society. For historians, his case illustrates the dangers of relying on incomplete evidence and biased reports, particularly when evaluating individuals with cognitive impairments in oppressive political contexts. Luck's death is emblematic of a broader historical pattern in which marginalized individuals are disproportionately vulnerable to both accusation and mistreatment. In reflecting on Luck's death, it is important to recognize the human dimensions, often overshadowed by sensational accounts. Beyond the alleged crimes and controversies, Luck was a man with intellectual and social challenges, living in a time and place where support systems were minimal or non-existent. His final months in custody, characterized by isolation, fear, and declining health, underscore the tragic consequences of a society that failed to protect its most vulnerable members. Ultimately, Bruno Ludke's death in 1944 remains shrouded in ambiguity. Whether it was the result of natural causes, institutional neglect, or systemic cruelty, the event marked the end of a life profoundly shaped by personal vulnerability and historical circumstance. The surrounding controversy over both his alleged crimes and the circumstances of his passing continues to provoke debate, serving as a reminder of the complexities involved in evaluating historical cases, especially those involving marginalized or impaired individuals in oppressive political systems. The next chapter will explore posthumous investigations and historical debate, examining how historians have reassessed Ludke's life, alleged crimes, and legacy, and what lessons can be drawn from the enduring uncertainty surrounding his story. The story of Bruno Ludke did not end with his death in 1944. In the decades that followed, historians, criminologists, and true crime researchers have revisited his life and the allegations of serial murder, attempting to separate fact from fiction. Posthumous investigations have raised profound questions about the reliability of Nazi-era records, the influence of societal and institutional bias, and the challenges of interpreting historical cases involving mentally impaired individuals. This chapter explores the controversies, evidence re-evaluations, and ongoing debates surrounding Ludke's legacy. Much of what was initially claimed about Ludke came from Nazi-era police and administrative reports, which documented alleged crimes, confessions, and patterns of behavior. At the time, he was said to have killed as many as 80 individuals, making him one of Germany's most prolific alleged serial killers. However, the methods used to gather this evidence were deeply flawed. Witness testimonies were inconsistent, often influenced by fear or social prejudice. Interrogations of Ludke, who had significant cognitive impairments, were likely coercive and difficult for him to comprehend, raising serious doubts about the validity of his confessions. Historians note that much of the narrative surrounding Ludke's guilt may have been constructed as much by the state's desire for closure as by any concrete proof. In the decades after World War II, researchers began to scrutinize the historical record more critically. Forensic and criminological studies of Ludke's case highlight several key points of concern. First, there is no definitive evidence linking him directly to all, or even most, of the alleged murders. Many of the deaths attributed to him could have resulted from natural causes, accidents, or illness, particularly given the high mortality rates in hospitals and care facilities during the 1930s and 1940s. Second, the alleged confessions are problematic given Ludke's intellectual limitations and the coercive interrogation techniques reportedly employed by authorities. These factors suggest that his perceived guilt may have been amplified by misunderstanding, fear, and institutional bias rather than actual criminal activity. The context of Nazi Germany is critical to understanding how and why Ludke's story was constructed in the way it was. The regime was obsessed with identifying and neutralizing perceived threats to society, particularly those who were marginalized, disabled, or socially awkward. Individuals like Ludke, mentally impaired, socially isolated, and present near unexplained deaths, fit neatly into a narrative that emphasized danger, deviance, and the need for strict social control. In this environment, suspicion could easily escalate into accusation, and circumstantial evidence was often treated as conclusive. Posthumous investigations have emphasized how much of Ludke's notoriety may have resulted from these ideological pressures rather than demonstrable criminality. Some modern researchers have proposed that Ludke may have been responsible for a small number of actual deaths, but not to the extent originally claimed. They suggest that his fascination with death, proximity to vulnerable individuals, and limited social understanding may have coincided with actual fatalities, creating a misleading impression of systematic serial killing. Other experts argue that Ludke was largely innocent, a man whose cognitive impairment and unusual behaviors made him a convenient scapegoat for a society eager to construct a narrative of crime and control. The truth is likely complex and multifaceted, obscured by gaps in the historical record and the biases of the investigators. Debates about Ludke's case also engage with broader questions of criminal responsibility and ethical treatment of the mentally impaired. Even if he did commit some violent acts, his intellectual limitations would have significantly affected his understanding of consequences, intent, and moral culpability. Modern legal and psychological frameworks would treat such a case differently, incorporating psychiatric evaluation, cognitive assessment, and humane procedural protections. Ludke's story highlights the consequences of neglecting these considerations and the dangers of attributing full criminal responsibility to individuals who lack the capacity to comprehend or control their actions fully. The posthumous examination of Ludke's case also intersects with historiographical questions about evidence, narrative, and myth-making. Scholars note that the sensational claims of 80 murders may have been amplified in part because of their shock value and the Nazis' interest in publicizing the containment of dangerous individuals. Over time, the story of Bruno Ludke has become a cultural and historical myth, blending confirmed facts with speculation, rumor, and ideological narrative. Understanding Ludke's life requires disentangling these threads to differentiate what is verifiable from what may have been exaggerated or constructed posthumously. Ludke's legacy has also influenced discussions within criminology and true crime studies. His case is frequently cited as an example of the risks of attributing serial killing patterns without rigorous forensic evidence. It underscores the dangers of relying on circumstantial evidence, coerced confessions, and societal bias, particularly in cases involving vulnerable populations. His story continues to serve as a cautionary tale about the intersection of disability, marginalization, and historical circumstance, demonstrating how social context can shape perceptions of criminality long after an individual's death. Moreover, Ludke's story challenges assumptions about the nature of serial killers and the construction of criminal narratives. While early reports portrayed him as a monstrous figure responsible for dozens of deaths, modern analysis emphasizes the need for critical assessment of sources, careful consideration of context, and recognition of bias. His case highlights how historical events, social perceptions, and institutional motives can combine to create a narrative that may not fully align with objective reality. Ultimately, the posthumous investigation of Bruno Ludke's life demonstrates both the complexity of historical research and the ethical responsibility to understand individuals in their full social and psychological context. Ludke may have been a troubled and socially awkward man, possibly involved in some acts of violence, but the scale and nature of his alleged crimes remain deeply uncertain. His case reminds us of the importance of critical evaluation, the dangers of ideological influence on criminal investigation, and the need to view historical figures with nuance rather than simplistic labels. The final chapter will explore Bruno Ludke's legacy, examining how his story has been remembered, mythologized, and debated in historical and cultural contexts, as well as the lessons it provides about justice, marginalization, and historical interpretation. Bruno Ludke's story, stretching from his birth in 1908 to his death in Nazi custody in 1944, remains one of the most controversial and debated cases in German criminal history. Whether he was a serial killer responsible for dozens of murders, or a tragic scapegoat condemned by circumstance and bias, Ludke's legacy endures as a cautionary tale about justice, vulnerability, and the construction of criminal narratives. This final chapter explores how he has been remembered, mythologized, and studied, and what lessons his case provides for understanding both the past and the present. In the immediate aftermath of his death, Ludke's name carried a dark reputation. Nazi authorities, seeking to reinforce their narrative of efficiency and control, presented him as a dangerous killer who had been identified and neutralized. The claim of 80 murders became part of the official record, reinforcing his image as one of the most prolific killers in German history. Yet this narrative was shaped less by verified evidence than by the ideological needs of a totalitarian state, eager to demonstrate its vigilance in protecting society from threats. As post-war Germany confronted the legacy of the Third Reich, researchers and historians revisited Ludke's case with increasing skepticism. Criminologists began questioning the validity of his alleged confessions, pointing out the problems of interrogating a man with significant intellectual impairments. Legal scholars highlighted the absence of forensic evidence linking him to the crimes, while historians noted the broader Nazi policies that often conflated disability with deviance. Slowly, Ludke's image shifted from that of a monstrous killer to that of a vulnerable man trapped in a system designed to exploit his weaknesses. Over time, his story has become emblematic of several broader themes. First, it highlights the dangers of criminal justice systems that prioritize expediency, narrative, and ideology over evidence and fairness. Ludke's case demonstrates how vulnerable individuals, particularly those with cognitive disabilities, can become scapegoats when institutions are more concerned with constructing stories than with discovering truth. Second, his story illustrates the risks of sensationalism. The claim of 80 murders, repeated and unchallenged for years, became ingrained in public memory, even though it lacked credible substantiation. This serves as a reminder of how easily narratives can become myth, shaping collective memory long after their factual basis has been questioned. Bruno Ludke's case has also sparked ethical and philosophical debates about responsibility and culpability. even if he did commit some violent acts. His intellectual impairment raises questions about his ability to fully comprehend his actions or their consequences. In modern contexts, such individuals are recognized as requiring special consideration, often through psychiatric treatment, legal protections, or placement in specialized care rather than punitive incarceration. The failure to provide these considerations in Ludke's time reflects both the societal prejudices against the disabled and the authoritarian priorities of the Nazi regime. His story also resonates with discussions about how societies treat the marginalized. Ludke was an outsider long before his arrest, socially awkward, intellectually impaired, and often viewed with suspicion by his community. These characteristics made him an easy target for accusation, reinforcing how prejudice can shape the trajectory of justice. His vulnerability was exploited by a system eager to create a narrative of guilt, and his inability to defend himself ensured that this narrative remained unchallenged until decades later. In cultural memory, Ludke has become both a symbol of horror and tragedy. For some, he remains remembered as a serial killer whose crimes shocked wartime Germany. For others, he represents the injustice of a man condemned without fair trial or sufficient evidence, his life destroyed by a combination of prejudice and authoritarianism. Documentaries, criminology texts, and historical studies continue to revisit his story, reflecting ongoing fascination with both the mystery of his alleged crimes and the injustices of his treatment. The lessons of Bruno Ludke's case extend beyond history. They remind us of the importance of safeguarding the rights of the vulnerable, ensuring that individuals with disabilities are treated with dignity, fairness, and humanity in all contexts. They underscore the need for rigorous evidence in criminal investigations, free from bias, coercion, or ideological pressure, and they highlight the dangers of constructing narratives that serve political or social purposes at the expense of truth. In the end, Bruno Ludke's legacy is not only about whether he committed murders, but about what his life and death reveal about society, justice, and human vulnerability. He was a man caught at the intersection of personal impairment and institutional prejudice. His story shaped as much by the circumstances of Nazi Germany as by his own actions. His case continues to challenge historians, criminologists, and ethicists to confront uncomfortable questions. How do we define guilt? How do we protect the vulnerable? And how do we ensure that history remembers individuals not just as monsters or martyrs, but as complex human beings shaped by their time and circumstances? Bruno Ludke's life, marked by hardship, suspicion, and controversy, ended in obscurity within the walls of a Nazi institution. Yet his story endures, forcing us to confront the uncomfortable truths about justice under authoritarian rule, the dangers of prejudice against the disabled, and the ease with which narratives can overshadow reality. His legacy is not only a reflection of his time, but also a warning for our own, a reminder that justice must be grounded in evidence, fairness, and humanity, especially when dealing with society's most vulnerable members.